threw her suitcase into the mud without looking at her. That was what she would remember years later. Not the cold, not the crowd of travelers who stepped around her like she was a stone in the road. Not even the sound of her daughter's sharp intake of breath. What she would remember was the way Station Master Gerald Potts did it without pausing his conversation with the man beside him. He just reached down, grabbed the worn leather handle, and swung it out the door in one easy motion, the way a man might toss out a bucket of dirty water, as if she were nothing, as if the small sleeping against Evelyn Hart's shoulder were nothing. Suitcase hit the frozen mud of the Millhaven platform and split at the seam. Everything inside a change of dress, a child's wool sock missing its pair, a folded letter she had read. So many times the paper had gone soft, scattered across the boards, like evidence of a life that had already been failing long before tonight. Evelyn did not cry. She was 31 years old. She had buried a husband 4 months ago in ground. So hard the diggers had to use pickaxes, and she was long past the point where humiliation could make her cry. Lily stirred against her neck, and that was the thing that nearly broke her. If you've ever stood somewhere and understood, with complete clarity, that you had run out of options, then stay with me. Because this is a story about what happens after that moment. What a woman does when the world has said no for the last time. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what comes next. Stories like Evelyn's stories, about courage you won't find in any history, book, are what we tell here every single week. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far Evelyn's story has traveled. Now let's go back to that platform. Back to the mud and the cold and the woman who was not done yet. The evening Evelyn Hart arrived in Millhaven, the temperature had already dropped below what was reasonable for October, and the wind coming off the open prairie had a sound to it, a low, traveling moan that made people walk faster and look at the ground. It was the kind of night that reminded you the frontier didn't care who you were. She had been on the train for 11 hours. Lily had slept for maybe 4 of them, fitfully, her small forehead pressing into Evelyn's collarbone with that particular heaviness of a child who has been crying and stopped, because crying didn't help anymore. Evelyn had eaten half a biscuit sometime around noon and given the other half to her daughter without mentioning it. Her back ached in a deep, settled way that told her it had passed beyond the point of complaint. The plan, insofar as she'd had one, was simple. Her husband's sister, a woman named Clara, who lived somewhere in the Millhaven territory, had written to them 3 years ago, before Daniel died, before everything. Evelyn had the letter, or she'd had the letter. The address was in it, written in Clara's neat, careful hand, but the letter had been in the left pocket of the coat she'd sold 2 weeks ago in Dunmore, because Lily needed boots, and the address was gone with it. What she had was the town name, Millhaven. And the belief, the increasingly thin belief that once she got there, she would figure the rest out. She hadn't figured it out. She had asked 3 people at the station about a woman named Clara Renner and gotten 3 different expressions that meant the same thing. They had never heard of her. She had gone to the station window and asked if there was any way to send a telegraph to the Territorial Registry Office, and the young man behind the glass had told her that would cost 30 cents. And she had 12 cents in the lining of her left boot, and she had not answered him, just stepped back from the window and tried to think. That was when she had approached the station master. Gerald Potts was a large man with a face that had settled permanently into the expression of someone who had heard every story and believed none of them. He had a mustache that had been waxed at some earlier point in the day and was now losing the argument with gravity. He was talking to another man, a cattle buyer, by the look of his coat, and did not look at Evelyn when she said, "Excuse me." He said it again. He glanced at her the way you glance at a door that has made a noise. "I'm not asking for money," she said, and she said it plainly, because she had learned that, leading with that, sometimes changed the quality of people's attention. "I have a child who's been traveling all day. I need to know if there's a position inside the station where we can sit through the night until morning, when I can sort out where I'm headed." Potts looked at Lily, then at Evelyn. The look lasted about 2 seconds and covered everything: the worn coat, the patched hem, the suitcase that had seen better years. "Station closes at 9, he said. "Passengers only. I purchased a ticket from Dunmore. Journey's over." "You're not a passenger anymore." She had not expected kindness exactly, but she had expected something slightly more than the mechanical indifference of a man who had already turned back to his conversation. She tried once more. She asked if there was a church, a boarding house, anywhere in walking distance that might take in a woman with a child on short notice. That was when he picked up her suitcase and threw it out the door. He didn't say anything while he did it. The cattle buyer paused his sentence for just a moment, then continued. Potts wiped his hand on his coat sleeve, a brief gesture of completion, and looked at Evelyn. 9 o'clock, he said. The platform was empty by 9:20. The last train south had departed, and the eastbound wouldn't come through until 6 in the morning. Evelyn had dragged the suitcase to the far end of the platform, away from the lamplight, where there was an overhang that blocked some of the wind. She had repacked everything, slowly and without any real belief it mattered. The left seam was split and would not stay closed, and she ended up using the belt from her skirt to hold the whole thing together, which was practical and humiliating in equal measure. Lily had woken while her mother was gathering the scattered clothes from the platform boards. She was 5 years old, and she had her father's eyes, the kind of dark brown that looked almost black in low light, and she did not ask where they were, or when they were leaving, or why their suitcase was broken. She just looked at Evelyn for a moment, and then she looked at the dark space beyond the station's overhang, at the prairie that started where the lamplight stopped. "Is it far?" she asked. "Is what far the next place?" Evelyn sat down on the platform boards next to her daughter and pulled her in close, arranging their one blanket over both of them. The wool was thin and had been mended twice across the middle, and it smelled like the inside of the train. "I don't know yet," she said. "We'll see in the morning." Lily leaned into her and was quiet for a minute. Then, "I'm not scared." "I know. I'm a little cold, I know." Evelyn pulled her tighter. "Me too." She had been many things in her life. She had been a farmer's daughter in Ohio, quick with numbers and better with animals than most of the men who worked the land. She had been a wife, a real one, not the decorative kind who had kept books for her husband's small freight operation and argued with suppliers on his behalf, and once, in the 3rd year of their marriage, renegotiated a contract with a grain merchant in Fayette County that saved them enough money to replace the barn roof before winter. She had been good at things. She had been, by most measures she cared about, capable. And then Daniel had gotten sick in the spring, and it had moved fast, the way those things sometimes did. And by August she was sitting in a lawyer's office in Dunmore, being told that the freight operation had debt. She hadn't known about notes he'd signed quietly, borrowing against the operation to cover bad season the year before, and that the house would need to be sold. She had not argued. She had signed what needed signing, settled what could be settled, packed what could be carried, and left. She was not someone who fell apart. She considered that both a gift and, at certain moments, a problem, because falling apart would at least have been honest about what the situation deserved. Cold came up through the platform boards and into her bones, and she sat with her back against the station wall and her daughter's weight against her chest, and she thought, with the particular clarity that exhaustion sometimes produced, "I need to get through tonight. Just tonight. The rest comes after." She did not let herself think about what happened if she couldn't find Clara. She did not let herself think about 12 cents and a broken suitcase and a prairie that began where the lamplight stopped. She focused on Lily's breathing, which was evening out. The child was going under, going to sleep, the way children could completely, the world simply turning off for them. Evelyn felt the small body grow heavy. That was when she heard the horses, 2 of them, coming down the road from the north, moving at the unhurried pace of animals who'd been working all day and knew they were close to home. A rider on the lead horse, a second horse on a rope behind, carrying what looked like supplies bundled under canvas. The rider pulled up at the hitching post near the station's west side, dismounted without ceremony, and disappeared around the corner of the building. She heard him try the station door. She heard the lock, then footsteps on the platform boards, coming her way. The man who came around the corner was maybe 40, or somewhere close to it. She would revise the estimate several times in the weeks ahead, never landing on an exact number. He was tall in the lean, functional way of men who worked outdoors and didn't think much about it. He wore a hat that had taken serious weather and a coat that had been repaired at the left shoulder with thread that didn't quite match. He stopped when he saw her, and he did not make a sound of surprise, which she would later think said something about him. He looked at her, then at Lily, then back at her. "Station's closed," he said. "I know," she said. He glanced at the split suitcase held together with a belt, the thin blanket. The way she was sitting angled forward so her body blocked the wind from her daughter. None of it lasted more than a second. He looked away toward the horizon. "Eastbound's at 6, he said. "I know that too." A pause. He settled his weight back on his heels, and she had the sense he was thinking something through. "It's going to get colder," he said. "It does out here. Around midnight, usually. I've been cold before." He looked at her again. And this time it was slightly different, not assessment. Exactly. But something closer to attention. As if she'd said something that required a second look. "I expect you have," he said. He pulled his hat off, held it for a moment, put it back on. It was a small, oddly formal gesture. "Caleb Whitmore," he said. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles north. I came in to pick up some wire that was delivered today, but it appears whoever closes this station isn't interested in waiting around." Evelyn Hart. She did not stand up because Lily was asleep, and she wasn't willing to disturb her for the sake of social convention. "I'm looking for a woman named Clara Renner. She'd be maybe 40 now. Lived around this territory. She's my husband's sister." Something shifted in his expression, slight but readable. "Clara Renner," he repeated. "You know her?" He was quiet for a moment in a way that told her the answer before he gave it. Passed on. "Winter before last, fever, I think. She'd married a man named Aldous Renner. He left the territory after." Evelyn heard this. She sat with it. The cold was coming up through the boards, and Lily's breathing was slow and steady, and the prairie stretched out beyond the lamplight. "Ah," she said. It was a small, inadequate sound, but it was the only one she had, because Clara had been the plan. Clara had been the thing she was walking toward. And now there was no Clara, there was no plan. There were 12 cents in her boot, and a 5-year-old asleep against her chest, and a man she'd known for 3 minutes standing on a dark platform telling her the last door had just closed. She straightened her spine. Old habit. She did it before she even thought about it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Whitmore stood there. He was looking at her the way people sometimes did when they were deciding something. "I need someone to cook," he said finally, "and help with the house. I've got 6 men on the ranch, and none of them can do it, and I've been making do since my housekeeper went back east in the spring." He paused. "It's not charity, it's work. There'd be a cabin small, but it's solid, and the stove works. You and the girl could have it." Another pause, shorter. "Pay fair." Evelyn looked at him. She looked for the thing that was underneath the offer, the thing that usually came with offers made to women in her position, on dark platforms, far from anywhere. She didn't find it. She found, instead, the face of a tired man who was trying to solve a practical problem with a practical solution, and who had the particular look of someone who expected to be refused. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I could be anyone." Could. He didn't argue it. "But you've been sitting on this platform for a while, and the only thing you've done is try to keep that child warm. That's something." She looked down at Lily, at the small, serious face relaxed in sleep. The boots she'd bought with the coat money, already scuffed at the toe from 3 weeks of hard traveling. She had promised herself she would not accept charity. But this was not charity. He had said so, and she believed him. And even if she hadn't, Her 12 cents said she didn't have the luxury of arguing definitions. Fair means what, exactly? She said. Something in his face changed. Not relief, something smaller. $8 a month, he said. 3 meals a day for you and the girl. The cabin is yours to use as long as you're working. She thought about it. She gave it the 30 seconds it deserved, which was enough time to understand that the alternative was spending the night on a platform in the wrong kind of cold and figuring out the rest in the morning with nothing. I'll need to know, she said, if there's any problem with my working arrangements. I get 2 weeks' notice, not less. He blinked. She had surprised him. 2 weeks, he agreed, and my daughter stays with me. She's quiet and she won't be in the way, but she stays where I can see her. That's not a problem. Evelyn looked at him one more time. She was not naive, and she was not reckless, and she knew perfectly well that getting into a stranger's company at 9:30 at night in a territory where she knew nobody was not the decision of a woman in a secure position. She also knew that the alternative was not actually an alternative. All right, she said, Mr. Whitmore. She gathered Lily up the child, made a small sound but didn't wake, and she picked up the belt-held suitcase, and she followed him off the platform and toward the horses. The station lamp was still burning behind her. She did not look back at it. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known standing on that platform, with 12 cents and a sleeping child, and a plan that had just dissolved, was that the cabin he was describing was 3 miles north through dark that her eyes couldn't fully read, and that the ranch she was walking toward was already caught in a quiet, patient trap that someone else had been setting for 2 years, and that she would be the one, in the end, to see it for what it was. But that was all ahead of her. That was all still in the dark, waiting. For now, there were just the horses, and the cold, and the sound of her daughter breathing, and the long road north into a life she hadn't chosen but was going to have to live anyway. She was good at that. She had practice. The road north was not a road in any way that word usually implied. It was a track, really, 2 parallel grooves worn into the prairie by wagon wheels and repetition, with a strip of dead grass running down the middle that the horses stepped over without thinking about it. Caleb rode ahead on his horse, the supply animal trailing behind on its rope, and Evelyn walked because there was no other practical arrangement. She carried Lily against her left shoulder, the child's arms loose around her neck, and the split suitcase in her right hand, and she focused on keeping her footing because the ground was uneven in the dark, and a twisted ankle out here was not something she could afford. Caleb had offered once to take the suitcase. She had said no. He hadn't asked again, which told her something about him that he could read a situation without needing it explained twice. Lily slept through the whole 3 miles. Later, Evelyn would think of that as one of the small, unlikely mercies of that first night, that her daughter did not have to be awake for the walking in the dark, for the cold that had gotten worse exactly as Whitmore had predicted, for the moment when Evelyn looked up and saw the shapes of the ranch buildings ahead, and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief, exactly. Something more complicated than that. Cabin was at the east edge of the main yard, separated from the bunkhouse by a stretch of bare ground maybe 40 feet wide. It was small, one room with a sleeping loft, a cast iron stove against the north wall, 2 windows with shutters that could be latched from the inside. The floor was wood, not dirt, and that was better than she'd expected. Someone had left a stack of wood beside the stove, and there was a lamp on the table with enough oil in it to last the night. Caleb lit it while Evelyn settled Lily onto the narrow cot in the corner, tucking their blanket around her. He showed her where the extra lamp oil was stored, where the water pump was in the yard, where the outhouse stood. He did all of this in a low, matter-of-fact voice, without looking at her too directly, as if he understood that she needed practical information more than she needed conversation. At the door he paused. "I eat at 6, he said, but there's no," he stopped, started again. "There's no rush in the morning. You've had a long day. Get some sleep." "I'll be up at 5:30, she said. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said, and left. She barred the door, sat down on the edge of the cot beside her daughter, and put her face in her hands. She stayed that way for about 2 minutes, not crying, just letting the shape of the day settle around her, the way you might let your eyes adjust to a new darkness. Then she got up, checked the stove, added a piece of wood, and lay down beside Lily with her coat still on. She was asleep in under 4 minutes, which was faster than she'd fallen asleep in months. The ranch in daylight was different than the ranch in the dark, the way everything was. There was more of it. First of all, a main house with a long porch, a barn that was in solid condition but needed paint, 2 outbuildings, the bunkhouse, a working corral, and beyond all of it the open land that ran north and west until it disappeared into sky. There were 6 ranch hands, as Caleb had said, and they ranged in age from a boy of maybe 17 named Cord, who still had the bony, unfinished look of someone who'd grown fast and hadn't caught up to himself yet, to a man named Ed Pruitt, who was somewhere past 50 and walked with a hitch in his left leg from a break that hadn't healed quite straight. Evelyn learned their names by the end of the first morning and matched them to faces by the end of the first day. This was not a skill she thought of as a skill, it was just paying attention, which seemed to her to be the minimum a person could do in a new situation. The kitchen in the main house was larger than she'd expected, and significantly more chaotic than anyone had warned her about. Previous housekeeper, whose name she gathered had been Mrs. Aldrich, had apparently organized the pantry by some system that had gone with her when she went back east, leaving behind a collection of supplies arranged in a way that made sense to no one. There were 4 different kinds of dried beans in 4 different unlabeled sacks. There was flour, and there was what Evelyn initially thought was flour, but was actually cornmeal. And there were 2 cans of something whose labels had been soaked off, and there was a jar of something preserved that she examined carefully before deciding she trusted it. She made breakfast: biscuits, salt pork, and the better of the 2 kinds of beans cooked down with some onion she found in the root bin. It wasn't elegant. The biscuits were a touch dense in the middle because the stove ran hot on the left side, and she hadn't learned that yet. But there was enough of it, and it was hot. And when the hands filed in from the morning chores, they sat down and ate without complaint, which she decided to count as a success. Caleb ate at the end of the table closest to the window. He had a way of being quiet that wasn't unfriendly, just self-contained. He said the biscuits were good. She said the stove needed to be looked at. He said he'd been meaning to, and she could tell from the way he said it that he meant it, but that it had been low on a long list. "I'll need a key to the pantry lock," she said, "or it removed. Can't organize anything if I have to ask for access." Pulled the key from his coat pocket and slid it down the table to her without discussion. She took that as a promising sign. Lily adapted the way children did not gradually, but all at once, as if the ranch were simply the new fact of the world, and she had already incorporated it. By the 3rd morning, she had attached herself, quietly but completely, to Ed Pruitt, which surprised everyone, including Ed Pruitt. He was not a man who had sought children's company, and he was gruff in the careful way of men who had been alone. Long enough that small social interactions required conscious management. But Lily had a way of sitting near people, not demanding attention, just being present, that apparently worked on him, because by the end of that first week, he had shown her how to braid a short length of rope into something resembling a bracelet and had explained to her, with total seriousness, the difference between 3 types of fence posts. Evelyn watched this from across the yard and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. She did not have time to think about it for long. There was always something. The pantry reorganization took most of the first week's spare hours. She learned the stove. She learned which of the ranch hands had food restrictions. Cord couldn't eat anything with too much salt because of a heart condition he'd inherited and was embarrassed about. And a man named Frank, who had come up from the territory south, was missing 3 fingers on his right hand and needed his food cut in a way he wouldn't ask for, but visibly struggled without. She started cutting it without mentioning it. He noticed but didn't say anything. She noticed that he noticed. The things people didn't say, Evelyn had found, were often the things that mattered most. Caleb Whitmore ran his ranch the way she would have expected from a man who didn't waste words directly, practically, without drama. He was fair with his men in the plain-spoken way, of someone who had decided fairness was simply more efficient than the alternative. But she could see, in the edges of things, that something was weighing on him. He would sit at the table after the men had gone out and stare at something on the far wall that wasn't a specific thing. He had a habit of picking up papers, reading them, and setting them down in a way that looked like he'd read them before, and wasn't hoping for different information this time. She didn't ask. It wasn't her place yet. Maybe it never would be. She had her own concerns. 12 cents had become $8, and $8 was not 12 cents, but $8 was also not much when you were trying to think about what came after this. Because this was not a destination, she understood that. This was a landing place. What came after required more thought than she'd had capacity for in the weeks since Daniel died, but the thought was accumulating anyway, the way water collected even when you weren't watching. She needed to find out if there was a school in Millhaven, or within riding distance. Lily was 5 and sharp and reading. Already Daniel had taught her letters in the last year of his life, sitting with her at the kitchen table in the evenings. The two of them bent over a primer together, Lily's face fixed in the intense concentration she brought to anything new. Evelyn was not going to let that stop. She needed to know the territory's legal situation regarding widows and property. She needed to know what the process was for getting a proper address established for correspondence. These were not small things. She had learned the hard way that the paperwork of a life mattered as much as the living of it, sometimes more, when the living of it came undone. At the end of the second week, she asked Caleb, at dinner, if there was a telegraph office in Millhaven. He looked up from his plate. Ned Barker runs the post. He manages the telegraph, too. Why? I need to contact the territorial property office, she said, about some records. She did not elaborate, and he did not ask her to. I'm going into town Thursday, he said. You could come. She said she would. The ride into Millhaven on Thursday was the first time she'd been in the wagon seat beside him for any length of time, and she had a chance to observe, in the particular way that proximity allowed, the things she'd only seen from a distance. He handled the horses with the economical competence of someone who'd been doing it long enough that he didn't think about it, which she found reassuring. He had a small scar below his left ear that she hadn't noticed before. He didn't feel the need to talk to fill the silence, which she respected. Lily sat between them, which had been Lily's decision, announced by simply climbing up into the middle of the bench and arranging herself there with the self-assurance of a small person who had decided where she was going to be. Caleb had looked down at her. Lily had looked back up at him. That's Orion and Deck, he said, meaning the horses. Which is which? Lily asked. He pointed. Orion's the one on the left. Deck has a white fetlock. Lily studied them. Deck's smaller, she said. He is, Caleb agreed. But he's got better sense. Lily appeared to find this an acceptable answer and was quiet for a while after that, watching the horses as if taking notes. Millhaven, in daylight, was a real enough town for the territory. A main street with packed dirt that had been graded at some point and was trying its best. A general store, a post office, a grain merchant, a lawyer's office above the feed supply. School, Evelyn noted with a small sharp relief, a one-room building set back from the main street with a flagpole that currently had no flag. She went with Caleb to the post office first. Ned Barker was a compact, efficient man who managed to conduct 3 separate transactions while she waited without losing track of any of them. She sent her telegraph to the Territorial Property Office, a brief factual message, requesting verification of records under Daniel Hart's name in Dunmore County. She paid the fee 40 cents, more than she'd thought from the wages Caleb had paid her the previous Saturday in cash. 4 crisp $2 bills that she had held briefly and then folded into her boot with the same care she'd given those last 12 cents. While she waited for a possible response, Barker said it might come within the hour. She went to the grain merchant, and she took Lily to the general store to look at the prices of things she'd need to order for the kitchen. The school had a sign on the door with enrollment information. The next term started in 6 weeks. 6 weeks was enough time to figure out if this arrangement was stable enough to plan on. She put the information in the back of her mind and went back to reading flour prices. Barker had a response waiting for her when she returned to the post office. She read it standing at his counter. Caleb was still at the grain merchant. The message was short, bureaucratic, and told her something she had not expected to find out here. On a Thursday morning, in a post office, in a town she'd been in for 2 weeks, Daniel had owned something. Not the freight operation that had been debt, that had been the thing she'd signed away. But before the freight operation, before she'd known him even, he had filed a land claim in the Dunmore territory, a modest 140 acres, no structure on it. He had never mentioned it. She had no explanation for that, and he was not available to provide one. And that particular grief was something she was going to have to set aside until later, and maybe much later, because the territorial message also said the claim had lapsed payments on the filing fee, had stopped in the year of the bad season, the year before he died, and that there was a 60-day window remaining in which an heir could apply to reinstate it. 60 days. She stood in the post office of Millhaven with this information and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, it wasn't that clean. It was more like the moment in a long, dark walk when you can see that the road curves, and even if you don't know what's around the curve, the fact of it changes how you walk. She would need a lawyer. She would need money she didn't have yet. She would need to understand the filing process, the reinstatement rules, the fee structure. All of that was ahead of her. But there was something to be ahead of her, which was not what she'd had on that station platform 2 weeks ago. She folded the message, put it in her coat, and went to find Caleb. He was at the wagon when she got back, loading the grain sacks with the help of a boy from the merchants. He looked up when she came around the corner. He had the beginning of a question in his face, but he didn't ask it, and she didn't offer. "Ready?" he said. Yes. They rode back north in the same easy quiet as before. Lily fell asleep in the middle of the bench, sometime after the first mile, her head tipsing sideways until it came to rest against Caleb's arm. He glanced down, glanced at Evelyn, said nothing, and kept driving. She watched the prairie and thought about 40 acres and 60 days, and the difference between a landing place and a destination. It was somewhere in the second mile that she noticed Caleb's jaw had a set to it that hadn't been there on the way in. He was looking at the road, but he wasn't seeing the road, she could tell, by the quality of his attention, which was pointed inward at something with edges. "Something wrong?" she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Ran into Roy Vance at the grain merchant," he said finally. She didn't know the name. "He made an offer on the north pasture." She waited. "Third one this year," he said. "They keep going up." "You haven't sold." "No." He was quiet again. "It's not about the price." She could hear that. She didn't know what it was about the north pasture, Roy Vance, what any of it meant in terms of the ranch's situation, but she could hear, under the flatness of his voice, that it was the kind of thing that kept a man staring at the wall in the morning. "Who's Vance?" she said. Caleb glanced at her, a short look, assessing not the information in the question, but her reasons for asking. "Cattle broker," he said. "Came into the territory about 2 years ago. He's been buying land." A pause. "A lot of it." "From people who want to sell?" Another brief pause. "Mostly." She understood the weight of that word. Mostly. She had grown up around men who did business, and she knew the difference between a transaction and a pressure, and she knew that the word mostly usually sat right at that line. "Is there a problem with the deed?" she said. "Your deed to the pasture." He looked at her again, and this time it lasted longer. "What makes you ask that?" "You said third offer this year. You said the prices keep going up." A man who wants to buy land fairly makes an offer, hears no, moves on. He doesn't come back twice more with better prices unless he thinks you might have to sell eventually. She kept her voice level, not pressing. Usually that means he knows something about your situation that he thinks works in his favor. Caleb was quiet for the rest of that stretch of road, long enough that she thought she'd overstepped, said something she hadn't earned the right to say yet. She looked at Lily, at the sleeping weight of her daughter, at the horse's ears moving with the road. "There's a water rights document," he said finally, "filed 4 years ago before my father died. The ranch is right to the creek that runs through the north pasture." He paused. "I've never been fully certain it was recorded correctly." "Did you have a lawyer look at it?" "Harlan Morse in town. He said it looked fine." "When did you ask him?" "A beat. 2 years ago." 2 years ago, right around when Vance had arrived and started making offers. She turned that around in her mind the way she used to turn figures around at the desk in Dunmore, looking for the thing that didn't add up, the number that didn't fit the column it was in. "Is Harlan Morse the only lawyer in Millhaven?" she said. He turned and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has just found a thought he should have had a long time ago, and is not happy about the fact that it took a stranger 2 weeks on his property to hand it to him. It was not an easy expression. There was something embarrassed in it, and something sharpened, and something that might have been the beginning of anger, not at her, but at a situation that had been sitting in a corner of his understanding for 2 years, not quite visible, and had just stepped into the light. "No," he said. "There's a man in the county seat, 40 miles east. You might want to have him look at it," she said. She did not say anything else, and neither did he, all the way back to the ranch. Cold broke in the 3rd week, the way it sometimes did on the prairie in late October, not gradually but all at once, as if the weather had decided to give everyone a brief reprieve before the serious business of winter. The afternoons went warm enough that the hands worked in shirt sleeves, and Lily spent 3 days straight in the yard, trailing after Ed Pruitt or sitting in the dirt near the corral drawing things. Evelyn couldn't always identify. Evelyn used the warmth to get to work on the things that needed 2 hands and good light. She found the problem with the main house's east window. The frame had warped and was no longer sealing against the wind, which was going to be a serious issue in January. She told Caleb. He said he'd known about it. She said she could reseal it if he had the materials, and he looked at her with the mild surprise he was learning to suppress and told her where to find them. She fixed the window. It took half a morning and went through 3 tries because the wood had warped unevenly and required filling in 2 stages. She didn't make a point of it. She just left the window sealed and moved on. Cord came and watched for a while. He was 17 and had the particular quality of very young men who are smarter than they've been given credit for and are waiting, with some impatience, for the world to figure that out. He watched her work on the window and then said, "My ma used to fix things like that. Didn't know women knew that kind of thing." "Your mother fixed windows," she said, without stopping what she was doing. "So you knew at least one." He thought about that. "Fair," he said, and walked away. She liked Cord. She liked most of them, in the specific way she had learned to like people not by idealizing them, but by figuring out what they were actually like and working with that rather than against it. Frank with his 3-fingered hand and his quiet pride. Ed with his hitching walk and his unexpected patience with a 5-year-old. A man named Gus, who whistled while he worked and went quiet when anything bothered him, so that his silence was a kind of communication. A younger hand named Tomas, who was from further south and spoke excellent English and very precise Spanish, and had a way with the horses that Evelyn found quietly impressive. She was building something here, she realized, in the peripheral way. Not what she'd planned, not what she would have chosen if she'd been in a position to choose, but the outlines of something, a daily life with texture, a child who was sleeping well and eating enough, a set of small competencies accumulating in a place where competence was respected because there was too much work for it not to be. The 60 days were running. She was aware of them the way she was aware of the cold that would come back as an abstract future pressure that required present preparation. She had written a letter to the county seat office, inquiring about a property lawyer, and she had sent it with a man going east, and she was waiting. Meanwhile, Roy Vance came to the ranch. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, and she saw him through the window, a man in his mid-40s, with a coat that was too good for ranch work, and an easy way of sitting a horse that spoke to comfort rather than use. He went to the barn, where Caleb was, and they were out there for maybe 20 minutes. She watched the clock on the kitchen shelf. She did not go out. It wasn't her business to go out. When Caleb came back in, she put a cup of coffee in front of him without asking. He sat down and looked at it. "He's adding 10 acres to the offer," he said. "Says he'll give me market rate plus for the pasture and the water rights together." She sat down across from him. "What did you say?" "I said I needed to think." He looked up. "I don't need to think. I'm not selling. But I need to know if I can afford not to." It was the most direct thing he'd said to her about the ranch's situation. She understood what it cost him to say it. This was a man who handled his difficulties quietly, internally, and the fact that he'd said it out loud across a kitchen table meant something. "What's the debt situation?" she said. He told her. Took a while. There was a loan on the barn, taken out after a bad season 3 years back. There were 2 notes with the grain merchant. There was a supply debt that had grown over the summer. None of it was ruinous individually. Together, across a bad winter, it had a cumulative weight. She listened. She did not flinch or offer false reassurance. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, organizing what she'd heard. "Can I see the account books?" she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I kept books for 5 years for a freight operation, and I'm good at it, and 2 sets of eyes on numbers are better than 1. She met his gaze. "You don't have to show me, but I can't help with something I can't see." There was a long pause. Outside, someone was moving a horse in the corral. She could hear the animal's hooves on the packed ground, the low voice of whoever was working with it. The kitchen was warm from the stove. "You'd do that," he said, "on top of everything else." "It's not charity," she said, using his own word back at him. "You're paying me to keep this household running. If the household stops running because the finances fall apart, I'm out of work. So it's practical." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "You always argue that way? Like everything's practical?" "When I need something," she said, "yes." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to a full smile, but it was there in the corners, something real. He got up and went to the desk in the back room and came back with the account ledger. She opened it and started reading, and didn't look up for the better part of an hour. And somewhere in that hour, she found 3 places where money was going that didn't need to go there, and 1 place where it wasn't coming in that should have been an old grazing agreement with a neighbor to the west that had apparently lapsed without anyone following up on whether the payment was still owed. She made notes in the margin, clean, small figures. Her handwriting was precise, a habit from years of keeping books that other people would need to read. When she closed the ledger and looked up, Caleb was at the window, watching the yard. He turned when she moved. 3 areas I'd want to look at more closely," she said. "But the account with Barrows to the west, the grazing payments, that one should be reinstated. That's money you're not collecting that you're entitled to." He was looking at her in the way he sometimes did, the look that was almost but not quite surprise, that had in it the quality of someone continually recalibrating a measurement. "My father set up that agreement," he said, 15 years ago. Still valid. The land use hasn't changed." He was quiet. "Then, how do you know it's still valid?" "I read the notes you had in the back of the ledger. The original agreement terms are written there." She paused. "You should talk to the county seat lawyer about Vance and the water rights at the same time. Bring the grazing agreement too. Have him look at all of it." Caleb sat back down. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the notes she'd made. "All right," he said. It was not a large moment. It was a kitchen and a ledger and 2 people who barely knew each other working on a problem that needed working on. But Evelyn felt something settle between them, not warmth, not yet, but something that had the structure of trust. The beginning of it, the frame before the walls go up, closed the ledger and stood. "Dinner in an hour," she said, practical as anything. "Right," he said. She went back to the stove. Outside, Lily's voice floated in from the yard. She was talking to Ed Pruitt about something with great enthusiasm, her words too quick to catch, but her tone unmistakable, the tone of a child who has found someone worth talking to. Ed's response was lower, slower but steady, present. Evelyn listened to it and thought about 60 days and 40 acres and the difference between surviving and building. And she stirred the pot on the stove and did not let herself feel too much of anything yet, because feeling too much too soon was how you misread situations. And she had come too far on too little to start misreading things now. The window was sealed. The books had 3 margin notes in them. And tomorrow she would write a second letter to the county seat, this time about her own land claim, because the 60 days were running, and she was not a woman who let things run out from under her while she stood still. She had been still long enough. The letter from the county seat lawyer arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after she'd sent hers. She read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, with the lamp turned low and the stove just beginning to pull heat into the room. His name was Arthur Seal, and he wrote in the precise, unhurried way of a man who understood that words in his profession had consequences and chose them accordingly. He confirmed that he could review the water rights document and the grazing agreement at her request, and that he had availability the following week if she wished to bring the relevant paperwork. His fee for initial consultation was $2. She wrote back the same morning, accepting. She did not tell Caleb about her own land claim. Not yet. It was hers to manage the 40 acres in Dunmore, the lapsed filing, the 60-day window that was now down to 38. She had enough of a plan to move on it, or the beginning of one, and she was not in the habit of announcing plans before she knew if they'd hold. She had learned that from Daniel, or learned it in opposition to Daniel. She was still sometimes uncertain which. What she did tell Caleb was that she had written to Seal about the water rights and the grazing agreement, and that she thought he should go to the county seat the following week and meet with him directly, because there were things in those documents that required a lawyer's reading, and not just hers. He looked at her across the breakfast table. The hands had cleared out, and Lily was in the yard with Ed, and it was just the two of them with the remains of breakfast and the sound of the wind picking up from the northwest. "You wrote to him already," he said. "I did. I hope that wasn't overstepping." He was quiet for a moment, and she let him be, because she had found that Caleb Whitmore's silences were working. Silences he was actually thinking, not performing thought, which was rarer than it should have been. "No," he said, "it wasn't." Another pause. "I'll go Tuesday." She nodded and started clearing the table. He stayed sitting for a moment, longer than necessary, looking at nothing particular, and she had the sense, not for the first time, that there were things in the man's situation that he had been carrying alone for longer than was good for anyone, and that he was not entirely sure what to do with the fact that someone was now in proximity who appeared capable of helping carry them. She understood that feeling from the inside. It was the particular discomfort of competent people encountering unexpected help. November arrived without ceremony and started making its intentions clear. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 2 days, the ground hardened, and the sky took on the flat, opaque look that the old-timers said meant serious weather was forming somewhere west and working its way east. Ed Pruitt watched the horizon in the mornings with the focused attention of a man reading a language the sky was writing, and what he was reading apparently did not please him. "Bad one coming," he told Evelyn one morning, when she brought coffee out to the corral where he was working. "Maybe 2 weeks, maybe less. How bad?" He shrugged, which on him was not dismissal but honesty, the shrug of a man who'd been wrong enough times to know the limits of his own reading. "Bad enough to matter," he said. "The cattle will need to be moved to the south pasture before it hits. More shelter there, closer to the creek, better ground for them to work. He looked at her. Caleb knows. He'll start planning. She went back inside and added 2 more items to the list. She kept on a scrap of paper in her coat pocket. The list of things that needed doing before winter was fully established. Storm lantern oil. Additional dried goods. She had noticed, reviewing the pantry in the 3rd week, that whoever had stocked it for the previous winter had done so for fewer mouths. 6 ranch hands eating through a serious prairie winter required better math than that. She brought it up with Caleb that evening, spreading her estimate on the table beside the account ledger. He looked at her figures, then at the ledger, then at her figures again. "I can authorize that," he said, "but it needs to happen before the roads get bad." "I know." She had already been thinking about timing. "If you're going to the county seat Tuesday, I'd need a list of what the general store in Millhaven can't supply, so I can give you the county orders at the same time." He looked at her steadily. "You've done this before, this kind of planning." "I ran a house and a freight business for 5 years," she said. "Planning was most of it. The freight business, my husband's. I kept the books and managed suppliers." She said it without weight, just information. He was better at the client side. "I was better at the numbers and the logistics." Caleb nodded slowly. He did not offer her sympathy, which she appreciated. He seemed to understand by now that she did not want to be handled with care on the subject of Daniel. What had happened, and she was living in the result of it. And sympathy at this point was a little like closing a barn door 18 months after the horse had left. "Give me the list by Monday," he said. "I'll take it with me." Caleb came back from the county seat on a Thursday, 2 days later than planned, which told her the conversation with Seal had been longer and more complicated than a simple document review. He drove into the yard in the late afternoon, unhitched the horses with the focused silence of someone who has spent 2 days holding something difficult and hasn't yet decided how to set it down, and came into the house without speaking. She had dinner ready. She had known, from the way he drove in, that it would be needed sooner rather than later. He sat down, ate about half of what was on his plate, and then put his fork down and looked at the wall. The hands had eaten earlier and cleared out. Lily was asleep in the cabin she had taken to going to bed at 7 with great seriousness, an arrangement that seemed to suit her and that Evelyn had not questioned. Kitchen was quiet. The water rights document, he said, was recorded incorrectly. She waited. "There's a technical error in the filing. Parcel description doesn't match the actual survey boundaries. It's been that way for 4 years. He picked up his fork, looked at it, put it back down. Seal says it's the kind of error that's hard to challenge if someone decides to. And Vance has a lawyer who found it. He looked at her. "How did you know?" "Because a man who makes 3 escalating offers on a piece of land he keeps being told isn't for sale has a reason he's certain eventually. That reason is usually legal." She kept her voice even. "What does Seal say about fixing it?" "It can be corrected. But it requires a joint application to the Territorial Land Office, and it has to go through a county hearing. The county judge would need to sign off." He paused. "Harlan Morse is the county judge's brother-in-law." She sat with that for a moment. "Who is Harlan Morse to Vance?" "Seal thinks they're in a business arrangement. He can't prove it yet, but he thinks Morse identified properties with correctable legal weaknesses, and Vance has been using those to make below-pressure offers. He waits until the debt gets heavy enough and the legal uncertainty gets uncomfortable enough, and people sell. And the properties he's bought, what does he do with them? He's applied for territorial grazing licenses on 3 of them. There's a railroad survey happening in this part of the territory, and whoever holds the large water-adjacent parcels, when the survey completes, will have significant leverage on right-of-way negotiations. He said this quietly, as if still working out the implications. "That's why the North Pasture. That's why the creek rights specifically." She understood it all at once, the way you sometimes did with a ledger when you found the one entry that made the whole column make sense. It wasn't about the cattle or the land in the simple frontier sense. It was about what the land would be worth in 5 years when the railroad ran through, and about a man who had positioned himself to own as much of the water as possible before anyone else understood what the water was worth. "How long does Seal think you have?" she said. "The county hearing to correct the document can be filed within 90 days. But Vance's lawyer has apparently filed a counter notice, a preemptive challenge to the validity of the water rights, which means the hearing will be contested." He looked at her. "Contested hearings take longer. Seal says if it goes badly, I could be looking at losing the creek rights entirely. And without the creek rights, the north pasture is half what it is. The cattle can't winter there. The whole ranch changes." The fire in the stove made a settling sound, wood shifting, and outside the wind was starting to move through the yard in the way it did when the temperature was dropping toward Sirius. Evelyn looked at her hands on the table for a moment, and then at Caleb. "What does Seal need from you to file the correction?" she said. "The original survey documents from when my father bought the ranch. He needs the complete chain." He paused. "I don't know if I have all of them. Where are the ranch's papers?" "The desk in the back room. The locked box." She held his gaze. "After dinner, we go through the locked box." He looked at her. There was something in his face that was complicated, not resistance, but the particular difficulty of a man who has been the sole keeper of something for a long time and is now being asked to unlock it in front of someone. There was shame in it, slightly. Not because of what was in the box, but because of what the need to look in it meant about how he'd handled things. She understood that, too. She'd sat in a lawyer's office in Dunmore with the feeling that she should have known about the debt, should have seen it coming, even though Daniel had kept it from her carefully. "All right," he said. They found 3 of the 4 survey documents in the locked box, along with the original deed, a set of correspondence from when the ranch had changed hands, and a folded paper at the very bottom that turned out to be a letter from Caleb's father to the county land office, disputing a boundary placement, a letter that had apparently never been responded to, written 4 years before his father died, in the same general period when the water rights filing error had been made. Evelyn read it twice. Then she held it toward the lamp and read a specific line a 3rd time. "Your father knew," she said. Caleb looked up from the survey he was examining. Knew what? About the recording error, or suspected it. She turned the letter toward him. The relevant passage was midway down a careful, formal objection. "Clinics teared me to the clerk's amendment to smiled the previous spring, questioning whether the parcel boundaries had been correctly transferred to the formal record." Caleb read it. She watched something move across his face, loss, maybe, or the particular grief of understanding something about a person after they were gone and couldn't be asked about it. "He never told me," he said. "He may not have known how serious it was. Or he may have thought he could handle it and then gotten sick before he could." She said this gently but plainly. "Either way, this letter is evidence that the error was identified contemporaneously. That helps you. Seal needs to see this." Caleb set the letter down. He looked at the collection of papers spread across the kitchen table, the documents of a ranch's life, the record of his father's decisions and his own, all of it laid out under the lamplight in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the dried herbs she'd hung near the window. "I've had that box for 3 years, he said, "since he died. I opened it once, when I was looking for the deed. I know. That letter's been in there for 3 years, and I didn't." "You were running a ranch," she said. "You were managing everything else." She paused. "You didn't know what you were looking for." He was quiet for a moment. Then he gathered the papers together, the 3 surveys, the deed, the letter, and stacked them with the care of someone who now understood their weight. "I'll ride to the county seat Monday," he said. "Get this to Seal. Take the grazing agreement, too," she said. "And I want to send a letter with you, for Seal to review separately." She hesitated just a moment. "About a different matter." He looked at her. She could see the question in his face, but he didn't ask it. He would, eventually. But tonight was not the night for it, and he seemed to understand that too. "All right," he said. She began stacking the remaining papers back into the box. Outside, the wind had found a new register higher, more insistent, pressing against the shutters with the specific purpose of something that meant business. "Storm's coming," she said. "Yeah." He listened to it for a moment. "Ed thinks within the week. We need to move the cattle before it hits." "I know." He closed the box, locked it, set it to the side. "I'm planning for Saturday." She nodded and stood, and started clearing the table. He helped her, which he had started doing, sometime in the second week, without either of them noting it. Just the natural distribution of tasks between two people who were both practical enough to see what needed doing. The storm arrived on a Tuesday, 3 days earlier than Ed had estimated, which was not a failure of his reading, so much as it was evidence that the weather on that stretch of prairie did not consult anyone's estimates before making decisions. Came in the night. Evelyn woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she had never heard before, a continuous, massive, pressurized roar, as if the sky had decided to put its full weight against the earth and was not interested in negotiation. Cabin walls were solid, as Caleb had said, but she could feel the stove working hard against something that was pushing back with equal determination. She dressed in the dark, fully, coat and boots, because she understood immediately that this was not a night for waiting to see what happened. She looked at Lily, who was still asleep. The child had her father's ability to sleep through large sounds, a quality Evelyn had always half envied, and crossed the yard to the main house. The hands were already up. Caleb was at the table with a lamp, and Ed was beside him, and the other men were pulling on coats and hats in various states of urgency. The first thing she registered was the way they were talking over each other, not panic, exactly, but a particular male operational noise. That meant things were already going sideways. "How many head are still in the north pasture?" she said, cutting through it. Caleb turned. He had that tight expression she'd come to recognize as the face he wore when managing something that was too large for one person to manage comfortably. 43, maybe 48. "We moved most of them Saturday, but the rear section, the fence on the creek side, took damage before we could close it." "Is the creek rising?" "Not yet. But if this keeps up through the morning, creek will rise." Ed said it flatly, without drama. "And if the cattle are still in that low section when it does." "I know," Caleb said. She looked around the room. 6 men, but Cord was 17 and not large, and Gus had taken a kick to the ribs from a horse 10 days ago and was still moving carefully. That was functionally 4 men and a boy for 40-something cattle in a rising storm with a broken fence section. "What do you need?" she said to Caleb. "I need 3 more people who can ride and handle cattle in the dark." He said it matter-of-factly, just the arithmetic of the situation. "I can ride," she said. He looked at her. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio," she said. "I've worked cattle before. Not this many, but the principle doesn't change." "It's not." He stopped. He was going to say it wasn't safe, or it wasn't appropriate, or some version of the objection that the situation didn't actually have room for. She watched him work through it and arrive at the arithmetic again. "You'd need to stay on the west side," he said, "away from the creek. The water comes up. You move back first. Don't argue with me on that." Agreed. "Lily, she's asleep and won't wake in that." She was already moving toward the door. "I'll tell Ed where she is in case she does." They rode out in the dark into something that was trying hard to be solid. The wind had a force to it that was not like regular wind. It pushed against her from multiple directions almost simultaneously, as if the air had lost its sense of direction and was simply trying to occupy every space at once. The snow was not the soft kind. It was small and hard, and it hit exposed skin with a persistence that had intent behind it. She could not see much. She could see Caleb ahead of her and Tomas to her right, and the moving shapes of the other men, and then the shapes of the cattle, dark, agitated masses that could feel the water coming and were not interested in moving in any organized direction. What happened in the next 2 hours was not heroic. It was loud and cold and confused and physically harder than almost anything she'd done in her life. And at one point, her horse stepped in something soft and she lost a stirrup and came very close to going over. Catching herself by instinct and a grip on the mane that she would feel in her shoulder for the next week. She swore, briefly and quietly, into the wind and got her stirrup back and kept going. Cattle didn't want to move south. They had the panicked, irrational stubbornness of animals in weather they didn't understand, and working them meant getting behind and beside them, and making enough noise and presence to convince them that moving was the better option. Evelyn had grown up doing this, and the knowledge came back through her hands and her voice and her body's memory of how to position a horse relative to an animal that was 3 times its weight and not interested in cooperation. She lost track of time. She lost track of the count. She knew the creek was rising, because at one point Tomas shouted something she couldn't hear over the wind and pointed, and when she looked, she could see the dark spread of water moving out past where the creek bank should have been. "Move," she said to the nearest animal, low and hard, pressed her horse into it, and it lurched south, and the ones behind it followed, because that was what cattle did when the first one moved. The fence section on the creek side went underwater, sometime around 4 in the morning. By then they had most of the cattle in the south pasture, and the gate was closed, and Caleb was doing a count by lamplight in the wind, and Evelyn was sitting on her horse trying to determine whether the shaking in her hands was cold or adrenaline. Both, she decided. Cord appeared beside her out of the dark. His hat had been lost somewhere in the previous hour, and his hair was plastered to his head, and he looked simultaneously terrified and more alive than she'd ever seen him. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "that back section we've still got maybe 8 head. They pushed back toward the cusp, already moving," before he finished. She found them bunched at the northeast corner, against the fence that had been standing before the water, undermined the post, the water now ankle-deep around them, and rising with the specific, patient authority of something that didn't need to rush because it was going to win, regardless. The cattle were frightened and making noise about it, which was doing nothing useful for anyone. She got around behind them. The water was cold, shockingly cold. The kind that reached into your bones, through rubber and leather, both, and her horse didn't like it. Communicated this displeasure clearly, and she held it firm and pushed forward because there was no other direction. "Move," she said again, louder this time, and she snapped the rope she was carrying against the nearest animal's flank, and it lurched, and the others followed. And she drove them south in the dark and the water and the wind until the ground was rising under her horse's feet and the water was falling back, and then she could see the lamplights of the south pasture gate ahead. Counted them through. 8, and the gate closed. She sat on her horse in the snow and felt the shaking in her hands and watched the gate and did not feel triumphant about anything. She felt very cold and extremely tired and mildly surprised to have remained on the horse throughout. Caleb found her there. He rode up and stopped beside her and said nothing for a moment, looking at the gate. 8, she said. "I know, I saw you coming in." He paused. "You went into the water. The fence post was undermined. They weren't going to move without being pushed from behind. I told you to stay west of the creek." "The creek moved," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The wind was still running hard, but the snow was thinning, and somewhere east, the sky had a different quality, not light yet, but the beginning of the idea of it. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she considered my shoulder. "I nearly came off about an hour ago." "But you didn't." "No." He looked away, back towards the south pasture, where the cattle were settling into the relative calm of shelter and solid ground. He had a look on his face that she couldn't fully read, something between anger and something else that was working to get past the anger. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could Tomas. So could Cord." She kept her voice level. "The cattle would have been in the water. They're cattle. They're your livelihood." She met his gaze. "You needed them out. I could help get them out. That's the whole of the arithmetic." He stared at her for a long moment. The sky to the east was definitely lighter, not dawn yet, but its approach. In that half-light she could see clearly the thing on his face that wasn't anger, that had been trying to get out from behind the anger, and it was something much simpler and much more complicated than anything she was prepared to examine right now. Come in out of the cold, he said finally. She followed him back to the barn. Storm settled into a hard, patient cold that lasted 4 days. The roads closed. The supply lines to Millhaven went silent. The ranch became its own complete world, 9 people, and a large number of cattle, all of them managing within the borders of what the land and the buildings could provide, which was enough if you were organized about it, and not enough if you weren't. Evelyn was organized about it. She rationed the food without making it feel like rationing, which was a skill she developed in the bad season before Daniel died, and which she was not particularly happy to be exercising again, but was at least competent with. She kept the main house warm with a rotation of wood that she managed herself because she didn't trust anyone else to be sufficiently disciplined about it. She ran the kitchen on a schedule that had no wasted motion. Lily, confined to the cabin, and then the main house, managed better than Evelyn had feared. Ed Pruitt sat with her for long stretches, and they developed a complicated game involving a set of carved wooden animals he produced from somewhere in his kit, and Lily explained the rules to this game, with the solemn authority of someone who has invented them and is not interested in revisions. On the second day of the storm, Cord's ribs were bothering him. He'd taken a hit during the cattle drive that he hadn't mentioned, because he was 17, and therefore invulnerable, or believed himself to be. Evelyn found out when she came into the bunkhouse with lunch and found him sitting very carefully on the edge of his bunk in the way of someone for whom breathing had become a negotiation. She looked at him. He looked at her with the expression of someone caught at something. Where, she said. Left side. It's fine, let me see. Mrs. Hart, it's Cord. He let her look. 2 ribs, she thought, or at minimum, 1 cracked and 1 badly bruised. She bound them with strips of cloth the way her mother had shown her when she was 12, after a similar incident with her brother and a fence post. Cord sat through it with the rigid dignity of a boy who was not going to make noise in front of a woman if it killed him. You should have said something the morning after, she told him. I didn't want to. He stopped. Didn't want to what? He was quiet for a moment. And then, unexpectedly honest, I didn't want to look like I couldn't handle it. She wrapped the last strip and tied it. You went into a blizzard to drive cattle at 3 in the morning, she said. You can handle things. A cracked rib doesn't change that. She paused. But you don't help anyone by keeping it to yourself until it gets worse. Thought about this. Yes, ma'am, he said, which she took as genuine. On the 3rd day, Gus developed a fever. It was mild but persistent, and she was watching it, keeping him in the bunkhouse with extra blankets and liquids. And when Caleb asked how he was, she gave him an accurate report and a realistic assessment. And he listened to it with the focused attention of a man who had accepted, over the past weeks, that her assessments were worth listening to. The 4th day, the storm broke. The sky went clear with the sharp, almost aggressive clarity that followed hard weather on the prairie, and the world was white and very bright, and the ranch yard was buried to the fence rails in places and perfectly clear in others, depending on where the wind had decided to put things. Caleb stood on the porch in the morning light, looking out at it. Evelyn came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one, and they stood for a while without talking, assessing the damage, the fence sections that would need rebuilding, the barn door that had partially separated from its top hinge, the long work of the following days already visible in the present one. Gus is better, she said. The fever broke overnight. Good. The cattle count is correct. I went through the south pasture tally with Tomas this morning. I know, he told me. He sipped his coffee. Evelyn, she looked at him. He was looking at the yard. The ranch would have taken serious damage, he said, without you, that night. He said it plainly, without ceremony, in the way of a man who had chosen the words carefully enough that embellishment would only reduce them. I want you to know I understand that. She looked back at the yard. The sun on the snow was very bright, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses was moving. She could hear it. I know you do, she said. They stood there a while longer, the coffee warm in their hands and the cold clean around them. and the work of the day, waiting with the patient indifference of work everywhere. And neither of them said anything more about it, because some things didn't need more said about them. They just needed to be acknowledged and set down and carried forward into whatever came next. And what came next, Evelyn was beginning to understand, was going to be something that required everything she had, because Roy Vance had not gone anywhere, and Arthur Seale's letter had arrived. On the morning of the second storm day, slipped under the main house door by a rider who had come through the weather on other business, and she had read it in the kitchen by lamplight while the wind worked at the eaves. Seale had found something in the counter notice Vance's lawyer had filed. A name. A notary stamp on a supporting document that matched the stamp on a deed transfer. Recorded 2 years ago in Morse's office, a property transfer that Vance had purchased from a family who later contested the sale price and lost, because by then the deed was clean and registered and there was nothing to challenge. It was not proof of anything criminal, proof of a pattern, and patterns. As Evelyn knew from 5 years of keeping books for a business where every number had to tell a consistent story, were the place where the real truth of a thing lived. She had written back to Seale that same night by lamplight while the storm pressed against the shutters. She had told him what to look for next. She had not told Caleb any of this yet. She would. But she wanted to understand it completely. First wanted to see the full shape of it before she described it to anyone else. Because she had learned from the ledger work and the survey documents and the locked box that the shape of a problem and the shape of a solution were not always obvious from the same angle. She was looking for the right angle, and she thought she was getting close. Seale's second letter arrived 10 days after the storm broke, on a morning when the yard had been cleared enough that the ranch felt like itself again, rather than a thing buried and waiting. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table before breakfast, the way she'd read the first one, and when she was done, she read it again more slowly, and then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and looked at the window. Outside, Cord was moving fence posts from the supply shed to the wagon. The fence repair work had begun the day before, slow going in the frozen ground, but going. She could hear him talking to Tomas, their voices carrying in the cold air in that particular way of voices. On a still winter morning, the words indistinct, but the rhythm of ordinary work conversation clear enough. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and started breakfast. She told Caleb after the men had gone out. She put his coffee in front of him, and then she put the letter in front of him and sat down across the table and waited while he read it. He read it once. Then he set it down and looked at her. "How long have you known about this?" he said. "The pattern with the notary stamp, I knew there was something in it when Seale mentioned it in the first letter. Asked him to look further. This is what he found." Caleb looked back at the letter. What Seale had found, in the 10 days since the storm, was this: the notary stamp appearing on Vance's supporting document for the water rights counter. Notice matched the stamp used on 4 other property transfers recorded in Millhaven's county records over the preceding 2 years. All 4 transfers had involved properties with some form of legal irregularity, a boundary dispute, a lapsed filing, a recording error. In 3 of the 4 cases, the original owner had sold below assessed value, within 6 months of Vance making an initial offer. In the 4th case, the owner had fought the challenge in county court and lost, with Harlan Morse presiding as county judge and ruling against them on a technicality. The 4th family had left the territory. "He's done this before," Caleb said. "Not a question. At least 4 times that Seale can document. There may be more." She paused. "The notary stamp is the key. The man who held that stamp, a clerk named Dudley Foss, left the county seat office 8 months ago. Seale is trying to find out where he went. Because if Foss was falsifying documents, or approving filings he knew were irregular, then there's a chain of evidence that connects Vance's operation to official misconduct. That changes the legal character of what he's doing from aggressive business practice to something the territorial court would be very interested in." She kept her voice level, because the shape of it was important to say accurately and without the edge of anger that was genuinely present but not useful here. Seal says he needs to bring this to the Territorial Land Office before the county hearing is scheduled. He needs your authorization to proceed on your behalf. Caleb looked at the letter again. She could see him working through it, not the legal mechanics, which he trusted her and Seal to handle, but the larger thing, the human thing. The fact that someone sitting on the edge of his land for 2 years, watching his debt accumulate and his legal position weaken, waiting with the patience of someone who had done this before and knew how it ended. Harlan Morse told me the water rights document looked fine, he said. His voice had a quiet flatness to it that was more unsettling than anger would have been. I know. I paid him to look at it. I know that, too. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Somewhere outside, Cord called something to Tomas, and Tomas called back, and there was the sound of wood hitting the wagon bed. What does Seal need from me? Caleb said. A signed authorization for him to file with the Territorial Land Office. He's drafted one, it's on the second page. She paused. And he'd like you to come to the county seat. Not immediately, but within 2 weeks. He wants to go through the full documentation with you in person before he files, in case there are questions he can't anticipate from the letters. Caleb turned to the second page, read Seal's draft authorization. His jaw had that set. She'd come to recognize not stubbornness, but the particular rigidity of a man who is making himself be still when he would prefer to move in a direction that wouldn't help anything. I'll go next week, he said. I'll bring everything. She nodded. There's one more thing. He looked up. When you go to Seal, I want to come. He was quiet. My letter, she said, about the separate matter I mentioned. Seal has been looking at that too. The land claim in Dunmore. Filing window closes in 19 days. She held his gaze. I need to be there in person to sign the reinstatement application. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly, because she suspected he had been waiting for this particular thing to surface since the night in the kitchen, when she'd said there was another matter and hadn't explained it. She had given him that much the knowledge that there was something without the specifics, for long enough that he'd had time to accept the shape of the unknown before she filled it in. 40 acres, she said, in Dunmore. My husband filed the claim before we were married. I found out about it from the Territorial Office. When I was in Millhaven the first month, she paused. It's not much land, but it's mine if I can file in time. He looked at her steadily. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Fair question. She had asked herself the same one, more than once, in the weeks since she'd found out. Because I didn't know you, she said. And it felt like the kind of thing that changed how people looked at me, and I needed to know how you looked at me first without that in it. He absorbed this. She could see him weighing it, not whether she'd been wrong to wait, but whether he understood it, which was a different question. And now you know, he said. Now I know. He turned back to the letter, looked at Seal's draft authorization one more time. Then he picked up the pen from the table she had put it there, she realized. Without thinking about it, just setting the table for what was needed, and signed the bottom of the page. We'll go Tuesday, he said. The county seat was called Harwick, and it was 40 miles east on a road that was navigable in winter if you chose your day carefully and had good horses. They chose a Thursday when the sky was clear and the temperature had risen enough that the road surface was firm without being iced. They left before dawn. Lily stayed at the ranch with Ed, an arrangement Lily had accepted with the equanimity of a child who had come to consider Ed Pruitt a reliable feature of her daily landscape. Evelyn had not been in a lawyer's office since the one in Dunmore, where she'd signed away the freight operation. She had been aware, every time she'd thought about this trip, of that particular association, and had worked to keep it separate. The Dunmore office had been an ending, and this was a different kind of errand. She had told herself this enough times that she mostly believed it. Arthur Seal's office was above a dry goods store on Harwick's Main Street, a narrow staircase, a door with frosted glass. A front room with 2 chairs and a desk where a young clerk sat and rose when they came in. Seal himself appeared from the inner office, before they'd finished introducing themselves to the clerk, but as if he'd heard their voices and come to the door out of the particular professional alertness of a man who had been working on something long enough that the people involved in it felt immediate. He was younger than she'd expected, late 30s maybe, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of careful, economical way of moving that suggested a man who had learned at some point that his physical size was not impressive and had redirected his energy accordingly. He shook Caleb's hand, then Evelyn's, and held her hand a fraction longer as he said her name in the way of someone affirming a person they have known only on paper. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "your letter about the Dunmore claim was very clear. It's not as common as you'd think." "I spent 5 years keeping books," she said. "Clarity becomes a habit. Then I hope you don't lose it." He held the inner office door open. "Come in." They sat across his desk for 3 hours. He went through Caleb's documentation first, the 3 surveys, the deed, the father's letter disputing the original recording. He asked questions in a methodical way, building a picture from the answers, and Evelyn noticed that he directed some of his questions to her without any apparent self-consciousness about it, which meant he had already, on the basis of the letters, calibrated who was carrying the analytical weight of this situation. The father's letter was the thing that mattered most. Seal read it twice, turned it over, looked at the date. This was written 4 months before the water rights counterfiling that Vance is now relying on, he said. If your father was already questioning the accuracy of the parcel description, and Morse's office was handling the county records at that time, it raises the question of whether the error was corrected in the filing or introduced in it. He paused. Introduced is fraud, corrected, but not fully would be negligence. Either way, it undermines the validity of Vance's counter-notice. "Can you prove which?" Caleb said. "I can demonstrate to the Territorial Land Office that there is sufficient irregularity to warrant their own investigation. That's a different and lower bar than proving fraud in court, and it's the bar I want to clear first." Seal set the letter down. The Territorial Office opens an investigation. The county hearing on Vance's counter-notice is automatically suspended pending the outcome. That buys time and changes the legal landscape considerably. How much time? Territorial investigations on land fraud allegations run 6 months to a year, typically, during which Vance cannot legally compel a sale or extinguish an existing claim. He looked at Caleb steadily. He would still own the properties he's already acquired, but his ability to move on yours would be effectively frozen. Caleb sat back. Something in his posture changed, not relaxation, because the problem wasn't solved, but the slight physical adjustment of a man who has been leaning into a wind and felt it ease by a fraction. "File it," he said. "I'll submit to the Territorial Office by end of this week." Seal made a note. Now he moved the Whitmore papers to one side and brought out a different folder thinner, but she recognized her own handwriting on the top document, Mrs. Hart. He walked her through the Dunmore claim with the same methodical care. The original filing, the lapsed payments, the reinstatement window. The reinstatement application required her signature, a filing fee of $3.50, and a sworn statement that she was the legal heir to the original claimant. The sworn statement needed a notary, which Seal's clerk could provide. The land itself, Seal said, looking at the original claim description, 40 acres, no structure, creek frontage on the eastern boundary. "Do you intend to develop it?" It was a question she had turned over many times in the previous weeks, lying awake in the cabin while Lily slept and the wind moved around the eaves. The honest answer was that she didn't know yet. The land was in Dunmore, 40 miles from where she was currently standing. It was a different territory from Caleb's ranch. What she intended to do with it was not a question she'd fully answered, because the answer depended on things she couldn't yet see clearly. "I intend to secure it first," she said. "What comes after depends on circumstances I don't fully know yet." Seal nodded as if this were a satisfactory answer. which told her he was a man who understood the difference between strategic ambiguity and indecision. The reinstatement will be filed in your name as sole heir. You'll have full legal title once the territorial office processes it, assuming no competing claim surfaces in the interim. Is a competing claim likely? The land has been unclaimed for 4 years. No one has filed on it. I wouldn't call it likely. He paused. But I'd recommend you write to the Dunmore County Records Office directly. Confirm. There's nothing pending. Do it this week, while we file the reinstatement. Belt and suspenders. I'll write today, she said. If you have a pen I can use when we're done here. He almost smiled. It was a brief thing, professional quickly, but it was real. Clerk will set you up. They signed what needed signing. Clerk notarized the sworn statement with the particular solemnity of someone performing a small but real official function. Seal reviewed both filings one final time, stacked them in the order he would deliver them, and looked across his desk at the two of them. You came at the right time, he said. Both of you. Another month on either of these, and the options narrowed considerably. He looked at Caleb. The ranching territories are changing faster than most people realize. The men doing what Vance is doing, they're not exceptional. They're working a system that has legal gaps, and they're working it methodically. A pause. Having someone who could read the documents and see the pattern, he glanced. At Evelyn briefly, not pointing, but the reference was clear enough. That's what made the difference. Caleb said nothing. He looked at the desk. What happens to Harlan Morse? Evelyn asked. Seal considered this carefully in the way of a man who gave accurate answers rather than satisfying ones. If the territorial investigation confirms coordinated misconduct, the Territorial Bar Association would be notified. A sitting judge involved in land fraud would face removal and likely criminal referral. He paused. But I want to be honest with you, that outcome requires the investigation to go all the way. Investigations sometimes settle at the edges. Vance's operation might be curtailed without all the actors being held to account. That's not enough, Caleb said. He said it quietly. I know, Seal said. I'll do what I can to make sure the file is comprehensive. The rest is in the hands of the territorial office. It was a truthful and insufficient answer, and everyone in the room understood it as both of those things simultaneously. They had lunch at the only restaurant in Harwick that was open on a Thursday afternoon, a small place with 4 tables and a menu written on a chalkboard that was running low on options by noon. They ate without talking much, the way people did after a long morning of serious conversation, letting the silence work as rest. Halfway through the meal, Caleb said, the grazing payment from Barrows to the west. I wrote to him last week about reinstating it. She looked up, and he wrote back. A pause. He didn't know it had lapsed. His son has been managing the property correspondence since Barrow got sick in the spring, and the son didn't have the original agreement. He thought the payments had been a courtesy arrangement and had ended by mutual agreement. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He's reinstating it from January 1st. That's $22 a year. That's meaningful, she said. It's not enough to change everything, but it's something. He looked at her. You found it. It was in the ledger. It'd been in the ledger for 3 years, he said. I looked at that ledger every month. She didn't have a comfortable answer to that, so she didn't offer one. She ate her lunch and thought about the things people carried without knowing they were carrying them, and about the particular way that a new set of eyes on a familiar problem was sometimes the only thing that could find what had been there all along. The account at the grain merchant, she said. The second note, the one with the higher interest rate. The Barrow payment reinstates in January, and we apply it directly to that note. It clears in 14 months instead of 22. He looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his calculation, face, not surprise anymore, but still something that was more attentive than his ordinary look. You worked that out? Last week. I wanted to wait and see if the Barrow reinstatement came through before I mentioned it. She paused. Changes the winter math. Not dramatically, but enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want you to take over the books. She set her fork down. Formally? finally, with pay adjusted. He met her gaze. What you've been doing, looking at the accounts, finding the grazing payment, the window repair, the pantry that's not housekeeper work. That's management work. He paused. I've been calling it one thing and getting another, and that's not fair to you. She looked at him across the small table in the small restaurant in the county seat, and she felt something that was distinct and somewhat inconvenient. Not what she might have felt for a man she'd known under different circumstances. It was too early for that, and she was too honest with herself to call it that yet. But the specific, grounded feeling of being seen accurately by someone who was in a position to know the difference between accurate and flattering, and who had chosen accurate anyway. What are you proposing? She said. 15 a month instead of 8. You keep the cabin. You manage the books and the supplies and the kitchen, and anything else that falls in that general direction. He said it plainly. And the cabin, I want to make the arrangement formal. If you're staying through winter, you should have something in writing. Something in writing meaning what, exactly? A lease. Proper one. $1 a year. Renewable annually at your option. He paused. Your option. Not mine. She looked at him. He was looking back at her without evasion, the kind of look that was hard to give and harder to receive because it required holding still while someone saw what you actually meant. Why? She said. Because you stayed on that platform when you had 12 cents and a broken suitcase, and you didn't ask anyone to feel sorry for you, he said. And because you went into the floodwater at 4 a.m. when I told you to stay clear of it. A pause. And because every problem you found on this ranch, you've treated like it was yours to solve, without anyone asking you to. He stopped. You should have something that's actually yours, that nobody can take. She was quiet for a moment. The restaurant around them had the particular midday quiet of a place where the lunch rush had passed, and the afternoon was not yet begun. Outside the window, Harwick went about its Thursday, with the indifference of a town that had its own concerns. All right, she said. He nodded. They paid for lunch and went back to Seal's office to collect copies of the filings. And then they started the 40 miles back west in the early afternoon light, with the kind of silence between them that was different from the silence of the ride. Out fuller somehow and less careful. The change, when it registered on the ranch, did so in the particular way that changes registered there, not in announcements, but in the daily fabric of things. Evelyn moved her small writing desk from the cabin to the back room of the main house, where the locked box lived and where the ledger now occupied the center of the desk with the authority of something that had been properly assigned. She kept the cabin as her sleeping place, and Lily's, but the working hours expanded into the main house naturally, and no one seemed to find this remarkable. The hands noticed something had shifted, because hands always noticed, and their response to it was characteristic of each of them. Cord was matter of fact, as if it confirmed something he'd already concluded. Ed Pruitt said nothing, but stopped redirecting his practical questions about supplies and schedules to Caleb, and started bringing them to her, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Frank, who had 3 fingers and the kind of pride that made him refuse every accommodation directly, accepted her adjustments to the way his meals were prepared without comment, which for Frank was the equivalent of a lengthy speech. Tomas brought her a jar of dried peppers from his own stores and told her they were better for cooking than what the general store in Millhaven carried, and she used them that same evening and confirmed that he was right. Gus, who was fully recovered from the fever and back to whistling while he worked, said simply, "Things run better," to no one in particular, one afternoon when he came in for lunch. It was not directed at anyone, and no one responded to it, and it sat in the room like a statement of fact. Roy Vance came to the ranch again in the last week of November. Came in the afternoon, unannounced, and Evelyn saw him from the back room window, the same too-good coat, the same easy seat on the horse, and she watched him tie up at the post and go to the barn where Caleb was. This time she did go out. She went to the barn and stood at the open door and listened to 3 sentences of Vance's proposal before he noticed her and stopped. He was a good-looking man. in the way of men who understood how being good-looking worked for them put together. Pleasant-voiced, with the particular confidence of someone who had been given good results for charm in the past and expected more of the same. He looked at her with the calibrated assessment of a man categorizing quickly. "I don't believe we've met," he said. "We haven't," she said. "I'm Evelyn Hart. I manage the Whitmore Ranch accounts." Something shifted, in his expression very slight, but she'd been looking for it. "Is that so?" "It is." She looked at him with the directness she had learned to carry, as a practical tool rather than an affectation. "Mr. Whitmore has authorized me to tell you that the water rights question is currently before the Territorial Land Office for administrative review, and that until that review is concluded, any offers relating to the North Pasture or associated water rights would be premature." She paused. "I can put that in writing if you'd like something for your lawyer." Vance was very still for a moment. It was the stillness of a man recalculating. She could see him doing it. The quick internal adjustment of someone who has walked into a room expecting a certain arrangement of the furniture and found it different. "Territorial Land Office," he said. "Filed this week." She held his gaze. "Administrative review typically runs 6 months to a year. I imagine your lawyer can confirm the procedure." Caleb was standing to her right, slightly behind her, and she was aware of him, aware that he was letting her run this, which was a different thing from stepping back, and the difference mattered. Vance looked at Caleb. "You filed a complaint." "A request for administrative review," Caleb said, "based on documentation that came to light. It's a standard process. There's nothing to review." Vance said, and his voice had changed. The pleasantness was still there, technically, but it was thinner now, a surface with less under it. "The recording error in your water rights was identified by my lawyer as an error that existed in the original filing and was not the result of any action by the current title holder," Evelyn said. "Yes. We know about the error. We also know about the notary stamp on the supporting documents your lawyer filed." She let that sit in the air for a moment. "Dudley Foss. Your lawyer should be aware that the Territorial Office knows that name." The stillness in Vance went from calculation to something colder. He looked at her with a different quality of attention, the kind that dropped the social formalities entirely. "You've been busy," he said. "The books needed organizing," she said. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. She did not look away. She had sat in harder silences than this. She had sat in a lawyer's office, in Dunmore being told her. Her house was gone and her husband's debts were hers to manage, and she had not looked away from that either. Vance looked at Caleb. "You should know," he said, "that this kind of thing has a way of getting complicated." "It already is complicated," Caleb said. "That's what lawyers are for." Another moment. Then Vance untied his horse, mounted, and rode out of the yard without another word. Caleb watched him go. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Dudley Foss," he said. "Seal found him," she said. "He's in the Territory South, working for a land transfer office." Seals made contact. She paused. "He's apparently open to talking." Caleb absorbed this. "When were you going to tell me?" "When I was sure it was solid. Seal's letter came yesterday. I wanted to read it twice before I said anything." She looked at him. "Foss knows what he signed. If he talks, it changes everything. What does he want in exchange?" Seal didn't say specifically. But the fact that he's willing to be contacted means he already understands that the situation he was part of has legal exposure and that his position inside it is more vulnerable than Vance's. She paused. People in that position usually want the same thing. To be on the right side of it before it collapses, Caleb said. "Yes." He looked out at the yard, where Vance's horse was already past the gate and moving east on the road. The afternoon light was low and gold, the kind of winter light that made everything look more permanent than it was. "He wasn't expecting you," Caleb said. "No. When he walked in here, he was expecting what he's always gotten." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think he'll do now?" She thought about it honestly. "He'll go to his lawyer. His lawyer will check the Territorial Land Office filing and confirm it's real. Then he'll evaluate whether Foss is his liability." She paused. "If he thinks Foss will talk, he might try to settle. If he thinks he can still win the hearing, he'll push forward. She looked at Caleb, which is why Seal needs to move quickly on the Foss contact, before Vance gets to him first. I'll write to Seal today. I already wrote to him this morning, she said, before Vance arrived, but the timing held. He looked at her. That look, again, the one that had started as surprise and had, over weeks, become something that was more like recognition, like seeing something he'd expected to be one size and finding it was as another, and having adjusted his understanding of the whole room accordingly. Is there anything, he said, that you weren't already 2 steps ahead of? The storm, she said. The storm surprised me. He almost laughed. It was a sound she'd heard very rarely from him, low, brief, more air than voice, but real. Storm surprised everybody, he said. Then we're even, she said, and went back inside to start dinner. December settled over the ranch with the weight of the serious winter the territory had been building towards since October. The days were short, and the work was concentrated into the light hours, and the evenings stretched long and lamplit and had a different quality than the evenings before the storm warmer. Not from the fire alone, but from the way people in a shared hard thing moves slightly differently with each other afterward. The letter from Dunmore came on a Wednesday in the second week of December. It was from the county records office, as she'd requested most, and it confirmed what Seal had said: no competing claims filed on the 40 acres, the parcel sitting clean and unchallenged in the records, waiting for her reinstatement to process through the territorial office. Processing time was estimated at 3 to 4 weeks, which meant that by the new year she would have land. 40 acres of it, with creek frontage, in a territory she'd left behind. It would be hers legally and completely, in a way that nothing had been hers since the house in Dunmore went to cover Daniel's debts. She read the letter twice and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and went to start the morning's work. Lunch, Lily told the table, with great seriousness, that Ed had promised to show her how to identify different types of hoof prints in snow, and that she intended to apply this knowledge systematically to all the animals on the property, including the barn cat. Ed, sitting at his end of the table with the expression of a man who had agreed to something without fully understanding its scope, confirmed this. Frank said the barn cat would not cooperate. Cord said the barn cat didn't cooperate with anything. Tomas said the barn cat had, on one occasion, cooperated with him, and that the secret was patience and dried meat. Gus whistled a few bars of something and said nothing. Evelyn sat at the stove end of the table and listened to all of it, this ordinary, slightly ridiculous conversation about a barn cat and hoof prints, and felt the thing that had no clean name, the thing that was not happiness exactly, but was what came before happiness when you'd been careful enough and long enough without it that you didn't trust the full word yet. She put more wood in the stove and filled the water jug, and listened to her daughter explain that she would need a notebook, specifically for animal track records. And she thought about 40 acres in Dunmore, and a lease that renewed at her option, and a cabin with a stove that worked. And then she thought about Seal's last line, the one she hadn't mentioned to Caleb yet. At the bottom of yesterday's letter, I believe we are close. Foss has agreed to an initial meeting. I'll write when I know more. Close. She turned the word over the way she turned numbers, in a column, testing its weight, checking its position, seeing where it led. Outside, the winter light was doing what it did in December on the prairie, going early and going fast, the sky pulling dark from the east, while the west still held a strip of something gold and stubborn. She watched it through the kitchen window for a moment, and then she went back to work, because the day wasn't done yet, and there was still plenty that needed doing before it was. Seal's letter arrived on the 23rd of December, and it was the longest one he had written. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table in the early morning, as she had read all the others, with the lamp turned low and the house still asleep around her. Outside the window, the yard was white and blue in the pre-dawn, and the cold pressed against the glass with the patient insistence of deep winter. She read the letter through once, quickly, and then she set it down and sat very still for a moment, and then she picked it up and read it again from the beginning. Slowly, the way you read something when you want to be certain you have understood every word correctly before you let yourself feel anything about it. Dudley Foss had talked. He had met with Seal in the Territory South on the 18th of December, and he had talked for 4 hours. And what he said in those 4 hours was this: that Harlan Morse had been in a formal business arrangement with Roy Vance since the spring of 2 years prior, under which Morse identified properties with correctable recording errors in the county records properties, where a legal challenge would be technically viable, and passed that information to Vance, who then initiated the acquisition process. Foss's role had been to provide notary stamps on documents that had not been properly witnessed, and to approve filings that contained errors Morse had instructed him to overlook. In exchange, Foss had received a flat payment per transaction. He had done it 5 times. The Whitmore water rights counter notice was the 6th attempt, and the first one that had been caught before it resolved. Foss had brought documentation. He had kept records not out of conscience, Seal noted with the dry precision of a lawyer who had seen people's motives clearly enough not to romanticize them, but because he'd been afraid from the beginning that Vance would eventually find it useful to have someone else hold the liability, and Foss had wanted insurance. The records included 2 letters in Morse's handwriting that referred explicitly to the arrangement. They included a ledger of payments, included copies of the defective filings. Seal had delivered the complete package to the Territorial Attorney's Office on the 20th of December. On the 22nd, yesterday, the day before this letter, the Territorial Attorney had issued a formal notice of investigation against both Harlan Morse and Roy Vance. The county hearing on the water rights counter notice was suspended indefinitely. Morse had been notified that his judicial duties were under review pending the investigation's outcome. Territorial Marshal had been dispatched to serve notice on Vance at his offices in the Territory. At the bottom of the letter, in the precise, unhurried hand she had come to recognize, Seal had written, "The water rights recording error will be corrected by administrative order as part of the investigation resolution. You will receive formal notice of the correction within 60 days. Mr. Whitmore's title to the North Pasture and associated creek rights is for all practical purposes secure. I will write again after the new year with further details. I wish you both a good Christmas." She put the letter down. She looked at the window, at the blue-white yard, at the dark shape of the barn on the far side of it. She had known this was the direction it was moving. She had known it since Seal had told her Foss was willing to meet, and she had known it more specifically since his last letter said the meeting had gone well. And she was not a person who let herself feel things before the facts supported the feeling, which was a quality she had that was useful and was also, she knew, sometimes a loss. But sitting in the early morning kitchen with the letter on the table in front of her, she let herself feel it now, the full, clean, simple weight of it. Problem was resolved. The ranch was safe. Creek ran through the North Pasture and would continue to run, and the cattle would winter there as they had wintered for the 20 years before Vance had arrived with his too-good coat and his patience and his notary stamps. She put the letter back in its envelope and went to the stove and put the water on for coffee. She had breakfast to make. There was still a ranch to run. She told Caleb after breakfast, when the hands had gone out and the kitchen was quiet. She put Seal's letter on the table in front of him and waited while he read it. She watched his face, which she had become good at reading over the months, and she saw the things move through it in sequence comprehension. Then the slow arrival of the full meaning, then something that was not quite relief, because relief implied the problem had always been manageable, and this one hadn't always felt that way. He read the letter to the end. He turned it over as if checking for more. He set it down. "Morse," he said. "Yes. He's been in that county seat for 15 years. He said it not with anger, which she might have expected, but with the particular tired disgust of a man confronting not a surprise but a confirmation. My father knew him. I know. My father paid him, probably, for something at some point. That's how it worked out there. You paid the county lawyer when you needed a thing handled. He paused, and Morse took his money and then went into business with a man who was going to try to take his land. There was nothing useful to say to that. She didn't try. What happens to him? Caleb said. Seal thinks removal from the bench is certain, given the letters in Morse's handwriting. Criminal charges depend on what the territorial attorney decides to pursue. She paused. Vance is the larger target. They may offer Morse a reduced exposure in exchange for full cooperation on Vance's operation. Caleb looked at the letter again, and Vance. The properties he acquired through the pattern, Foss described the families that sold under pressure. Those transactions are going to be reviewed. Whether they can be unwound depends on the individual circumstances. The law is imperfect on that. She said it plainly, because it was true, and because he deserved an accurate answer. Vance may keep some of what he acquired, but his ability to continue acquiring, and the railroad right-of-way, leverage he was positioning, for that's finished. He sat with this. The fire in the stove crackled and then settled. Outside, she could hear Cord's voice from the direction of the corral, and the steady sound of someone working with an axe somewhere further off. The railroad, he said. The survey proceeds, she said. But the right-of-way negotiations will happen with the actual landowners, not with a man who's acquired their water rights through fraudulent challenges. She paused. Means the creek frontage you have on the north pasture may be worth a conversation with the railroad surveying office at some point. He looked at her. You've been thinking about that. I noticed it in Seal's earlier letter. He mentioned it in passing, and I've been thinking about it since. He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He put his face in his hands, not in distress, but in the way of someone who has been carrying something at a specific tension for a long time, and has just been told they can set it down, and needs a moment in which the adjustment can happen privately. She looked at the window and gave him that moment without comment. When he looked up, his face was the face of a man who had come through something. Evelyn, he said. I know, she said, because she did. Christmas on the ranch was a quieter thing than the word usually implied. There was no elaborate celebration, and no one expected one. These were working men in a working place, in the middle of a prairie winter, and the holiday was marked mostly by the fact that there was no fence work scheduled, and Evelyn made a meal that took most of the day and was substantially better than the ordinary. She had been planning it for a week. She had requisitioned supplies from Millhaven with the careful efficiency she brought to anything she planned. And she had spent the 2 days before in the kind of focused kitchen work that required presence and attention and left very little room for any other kind of thinking, which was, she suspected, partly why she'd thrown herself into it. There was roast, and there were proper biscuits. She had learned the stove's particular personality by now and could coax it, and there were 2 pies, 1 apple and 1 sweet potato, that Lily had assisted with in the precise, serious way she assisted with anything she was allowed to participate in. Lily's contribution to the apple pie was peeling, which she did with the focused application of a child who had been given a real tool and a real job and intended to demonstrate that this trust was warranted. Ed Pruitt watched her peel apples for a while with an expression that he probably didn't know he was making. It was the expression of a man being reminded of something he hadn't thought about in a long time. The meal was loud, in the way that meals with 7 adults and a child were loud, when people were comfortable enough to talk across each other without self-consciousness. Frank, whose quiet was usually constitutional, told a long story about a cattle drive he'd been on 6 years prior that ended in a way nobody at the table had anticipated, and that produced genuine laughter from Gus, who did not laugh often, and did it thoroughly when he did. Cord asked Tomas about the territory south, and Tomas told him enough to make it sound both more dangerous and more interesting than Cord's experience of the world so far, which was clearly the intended effect and was received as such. Caleb's sat at the head of the table and was quieter than usual, but it was a different quiet than his ordinary one. Not weighted. Something had gone out of it. Lily sat between Ed and Tomas and ate more than Evelyn would have thought possible for someone of her size, and periodically offered observations about the food, with the frank assessments of a person who had not yet learned that enthusiasm, and the criticism should be deployed with more social calculation. She said the sweet potato pie was better than the apple, but that she felt bad saying so because she had helped with both of them. Tomas told her that honesty was a virtue and that she should not feel bad. Ed said he agreed. Cord said he thought they were equal. Frank said the crust on the apple was better, but the filling on the sweet potato was better, and that therefore they could not be compared directly. This prompted a discussion that lasted 10 minutes and reached no conclusion, which seemed to be the point. Evelyn sat at the stove end of the table and listened and ate and felt the thing that she had given herself permission to feel, finally, completely. Not the cautious beginning of it that she'd been managing since November, but the full version. The warmth of a room full of people who had earned each other's company through the daily unglamorous, real work of living in proximity and choosing repeatedly not to be unkind. This was not what she had planned for her life. She had planned a different life, a smaller one in some ways, more straightforward, the life of a woman who kept books for a freight business in Ohio and raised children and knew what next year looked like from the shape of the current one. That life had ended in a way she had not chosen, and she had walked away from the end of it with 12 cents and a broken suitcase. And what she had now was so different from what she'd planned that comparing them was almost meaningless. But she had learned over these months that the life you didn't plan could have a particular quality, that the planned life sometimes lacked the quality of things genuinely chosen under pressure, proven under real conditions, held because you decided to hold them, and not because circumstances simply kept them in place. The ranch hands at this table had not been her family by design. They had become something close to it by the accumulation of small daily choices. Her choice to cut Frank's food without mentioning it. Ed's choice to take a 5-year-old's question seriously. Cord's choice to tell her honestly that he was scared of looking weak. None of these were large choices. They were all the only kind that ultimately mattered. The new year came in with a week of hard cold followed by a slow thaw that the land accepted gratefully. Seal wrote in the second week of January, with an update on the territorial investigation. Morse had, as predicted, agreed to full cooperation in exchange for a reduced charge, and his testimony had substantially reinforced the case against Vance. Territorial Marshal had formally served Vance with notice that 3 of the 5 previously acquired properties were under review for involuntary sale determination. Vance had retained a lawyer from the Capital Territory and was fighting it, but Seal's assessment was that the fighting would be expensive and would not ultimately succeed. The water rights correction order arrived on the 15th of January. An official document from the Territorial Land Office bearing 3 separate signatures and a wax seal confirming that the recording error in the Whitmore water rights filing had been corrected by administrative order, and that the title to the creek frontage through the North Pasture was held in full and without encumbrance by Caleb James Whitmore. Caleb held the document for a long time without saying anything. Then he put it in the locked box with the surveys and the deed and his father's letter, and he locked it work, and he locked it. That evening, he told Evelyn he wanted to write to the Railroad Survey Office. She said she'd already drafted a letter and asked if he wanted to review it before she sent it. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said yes, and she got the letter from the desk and gave it to him, and he read it and said it was good. She sent it. Her own title came through on the 22nd of January, a document from the Territorial Office confirming the reinstatement of the Dunmore land claim and the issuance of formal title in the name of Evelyn Margaret Hart, 40 acres with creek frontage on the eastern boundary, hers, completely in the eyes of the law and the territory. She read the document at the desk in the back room of the main house, in the middle of the afternoon, alone. She read it once, and then she folded it carefully and held it for a moment, and then she put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest. which was not a practical place to keep a legal document, but which was where it needed to be for the rest of that day. She had not told Lily yet what the land meant. Lily knew there was a piece of land she'd mentioned it once, carefully, as something that might exist, and Lily had accepted this information with the adaptable equanimity of a child whose experience of the world had already demonstrated that the important things came from unexpected directions. The land was in Dunmore, which was far from here, and what it meant in terms of their lives going forward was still a question. It was a question Evelyn had been sitting with for weeks. The land was hers. The ranch was not hers, but she had a place in it that was real and documented and renewable at her option. These were two different things. They were also not necessarily incompatible, and the precise relationship between them was something she was going to have to figure out in time and in reality rather than in the abstract. Still thinking about it when Caleb knocked on the back room door. That evening, after dinner, when the house had gone quiet, "Document came for you today," he said. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her with the look she knew well. By now the direct, unembellished attention of a man who had decided some time ago that the social forms that encouraged people to say less than they meant were not worth the trouble. "The Dunmore land," he said. "Yes. Is that—" He stopped, started differently. "What are you going to do with it?" She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said. "What do you think I should do with it?" It was a real question. She asked it as one. He heard it that way. He came into the room and sat in the second chair, the one that had appeared in the back room sometime in November, and whose arrival she had never commented on, and neither had he. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the desk, at the ledger she'd been working in before the document arrived. "Think," he said, "that 40 acres with creek frontage in Dunmore could run maybe 30 head, if the land is what the claim says it is. Small operation. Someone would need to manage it." He paused. "Or it could be leased to a neighboring ranch for grazing. That would produce income without requiring you to be there." Another pause. "Or it could stay vacant. It's yours either way." "You've been thinking about it," she said, "since you told me about it in Harwick." She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp between them was low and steady, and outside the January wind was moving around the eaves, with the sound she'd learned to read as moderate, not threatening, just present. "Caleb," she said, "what are you actually asking me?" He was quiet for the length of 3 slow breaths. She waited because she had learned that his silences were not evasions, but preparations. He was someone who needed to find the exact words before he said them, and the words he needed were not always easy to find. "I'm asking if you're planning to leave," he said. "When the land comes through and the investigation is settled and things are stable here. Plan." "It wasn't the plan," she said. "I didn't have a plan. I had 12 cents and a broken suitcase on a station platform." "I know that. I'm asking about now." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. She thought about the back room desk and the ledger with her margin notes. She thought about Lily and Ed Pruitt and the barn cat and a notebook specifically for animal track records. She thought about the north pasture and the creek that ran through it and the railroad survey office letter she'd already drafted and sent. "No," she said, "I'm not planning to leave." He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, the particular quality of attention in his face, the slight adjustment in his posture, as if he had been holding himself at a certain angle against the possibility of a different answer, and could now straighten. "Dunmore land," he said. "If it was leased for grazing, the income would help with the grain merchant note, clear it faster than the barrow payment alone." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking the same thing." And if he stopped again, she waited. "If the circumstances change at some point, things between us," he looked at her directly, which for him was the most unguarded of speech, the substitute for the words he couldn't find the exact shape of. "I want you to know that whatever I have here, I intend it to be yours as much as it is mine. That's not something I say without thinking about it." The room was very quiet. The fire in the stove behind her made its small, settled sounds. She could hear, from somewhere at the far end of the house, the distant small sound of Lily turning in her sleep the child's dreams audible as movement, as the shift of a small body in a warm bed in a house where she felt safe. That sound. That was the one that got through the practical armor of her. Not the land documents, not the legal victories, not the money in the account, or the lease renewable at her option. That sound which was only possible because the house was solid and the stove worked, and there was someone at the other end of it who had made space for them both without making them feel the weight of the accommodation. "I know," she said. "I know that." He nodded. He was not a man who needed more than that, when what was said was enough. "Tuesday," she said. "The Railroad Survey Office should have the letter by now. We should think about how to prepare for that conversation." He almost smiled now. "It can wait until morning," she said. "But I've been thinking about the approach, and I'd like to talk through it before we respond." "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning." He stood, and at the door he paused in the way he sometimes did, not uncertainty, just the complete version of a moment before it ended. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up from the desk. "The night at the station," he said, "found you. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I want you to know that. I didn't have a plan either." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "That's why I trusted it." He nodded once and went. The spring came the way. Spring came on the prairie, not gently, not all at once, but in the argued and impermanent way of a season that has to fight its way in against the previous one. There were days in March that felt like winter's last serious attempt, and days in April, where the whole land changed color, and the mud was the smell of something beginning. The Railroad Survey Office wrote back in February with an invitation to a formal meeting in March, which Evelyn prepared for with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that preparation was the thing that turned conversations from luck to outcome. She brought 3 documents to that meeting: a survey of the North Pastures Creek frontage, an estimate of the acreage involved in any potential right-of-way, and a counter-proposal to the railroad standard compensation framework that she had researched through SEAL and found to be substantially below fair market value for water-adjacent land in an area with the survey's projected traffic volume. The railroad's representative, a man named Aldrich, who had come prepared to negotiate with a rancher, found himself instead negotiating with someone who had read his company's standard framework, understood where its assumptions were weak, and had a counterproposal that was specific and documented, and would require actual engagement rather than the usual back and forth of someone who didn't know what they were worth. The meeting lasted 4 hours. They left with an agreed framework that was 30% above the railroad's initial offer, which SEAL, reviewing it afterward, said was the best right-of-way outcome he had seen in this territory in 5 years. Caleb told her this with the look she knew, the one that was not quite surprise anymore, that had become something more like the steady recognition of someone who has understood, finally and completely, what kind of person they are dealing with. The territorial investigation resolved in April. Harlan Morse was formally removed from the bench and pled to a reduced charge of official misconduct, receiving a fine and the permanent loss of his legal license. Roy Vance faced a fuller accounting, 4 counts of fraud-adjacent land acquisition, 1 count of document falsification through an agent, and the forced return of 2 of the 5 properties acquired through the scheme. The families who had sold under pressure in 2 of those cases received the difference between their sale price and the assessed value, paid from a fund established as part of Vance's settlement. It was not a perfect justice. Vance retained money and properties that probably should not have been his, but it was real, documented, and it ended his operation in the territory permanently. Dudley Foss, whose records had made the whole case possible, received a formal caution and no criminal charge. He had known what he was doing when he did it, and he had done it for money, and the caution was light for that. But the caution was also the only realistic outcome, given what his cooperation had made possible. And Evelyn had made her peace with the imperfection of it in the way she had made her peace with most imperfect outcomes, by focusing on what had been achieved rather than on the distance between achievement and ideal. Seals wrote in his final letter on the matter. Justice in these territories is often partial. The question is whether it is sufficient to allow people to continue building their lives. I believe in this case it is. She kept that letter. The Dunmore land was leased to a neighboring ranch in March, a straightforward arrangement that produced $31 annually and required nothing of her beyond a yearly correspondence to confirm the terms. It was not a large income. Combined with the barrow grazing payments and the right-of-way income and her adjusted wages, it was enough to give her a financial independence that was real rather than theoretical. She kept her accounts separately. She had told Caleb she was doing this, and he had said he wouldn't have expected anything else, which was the right answer, and she'd told him so. Lily started school in the spring term. She walked to Millhaven 3 days a week with Cord, who had business in town on those mornings, and had offered, without being asked, which Evelyn counted as evidence of something good in him. Lily came home on those days with the particular charged energy of a child who has been given new material to process and is not yet sure what to do with all of it. She brought questions home, the way other children brought muddy boots in quantity, unavoidably requiring engagement. Ed Pruitt had become, over the course of the winter and into the spring, something that did not have a clean name but was in practice the closest thing Lily had to a grandfather. Taught her the things he knew, rope work, animal reading, the way weather moved across the land with the gravity of someone transmitting knowledge that mattered, and she received it with the seriousness it was given. He was not an easy man, and he did not pretend to be, and Lily seemed to understand this and work with it rather than around it, which was a quality Evelyn recognized in her daughter as her own. One afternoon in May, Evelyn was at the desk in the back room when she heard Caleb come in through the main door and stop, which was not what he usually did. He usually went straight through to the kitchen or the back. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway of the back room with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has been thinking about something for a long time and has decided today is the day. There's something I want to ask you, he said. She put her pen down. All right. He came in and sat down in his chair. He looked at the desk for a moment, then at her. I'm not good at this kind of thing, he said. I want to be honest about that first. I know, she said. I've noticed. He almost smiled. Then, seriously, I've been thinking about it since February, maybe longer. And I don't want to make it more complicated than it is, but I also don't want to make it less. Because you're someone who deserves an honest statement of the thing. Caleb, I want you to marry me, he said. Not because it's practical, though it is. Not because it's the next logical step, though maybe it is that too. Because I would rather build what comes next with you in it than without you. Because I have not met another person who makes me think as clearly or feel as sure that the thinking is getting somewhere. He paused. And because your daughter has started calling Ed Grandpa Ed when she thinks no one can hear, and I would like, if you're willing, for her to have something to call me too. She sat across the desk from him in the quiet of the back room, and she thought about a station platform in October and a suitcase split at the seam, and a man who had taken off his hat in a gesture that was small and oddly formal and had said, I expect you have, when she told him she'd been cold before. She thought about all the small things that added up to a person. Not the large gestures. This territory had plenty of large gestures, most of them unreliable but the small ones. The way he'd slid the pantry key down the table without making her ask twice. The way he'd held the horses steady on the night of the cattle drive, just visible in the dark ahead of her, the sound of him a steadying thing. The way he'd sat in the chair in this room for months, showing up at the edge of things without demanding the center of them. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. And I want you to know it's not because it's practical either. I have my own land and my own income, and I don't need your name on any document that matters to me. She held his gaze. I want to, because I would rather do what comes next with you than without you. That's all. That's the whole of it. He reached across the desk, put her hand in his. It was not a dramatic gesture. Two people in a back room, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the ledger open on the desk between them, the sound of the yard outside going about its regular business, Cord's voice, a horse, the distant whistle that meant Gus was in a good mood. His hand was calloused and large and warm, and she left hers in it, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The wedding was small, in June at the ranch. Seal came from Harwick, which was more than his professional relationship required, and meant something on that basis. Ed Pruitt wore his best coat, which he had apparently pressed carefully the night before, an act of preparation that Lily observed and reported to Evelyn with the solemn weight of news. Tomas brought flowers from somewhere she didn't ask. They appeared, bright and impractical, and exactly right. Frank stood straight and serious, and clapped afterward with his six-fingered hands. Cord stood next to Ed, and was taller than he'd been in October, and was still growing. Lily stood next to her mother through the whole thing, holding her hand, and when it was done she looked up at Caleb with the assessing dark-eyed look that was her father's and said, "Are you my stepfather now?" Caleb looked down at her. "If that's all right with you," he said. Thought about it. "What should I call you?" "Whatever you want," he said. "I'll answer to most things." She thought about it some more. "I'll think about it," she said, with the gravity of someone for whom a name was not a small decision, and went to find Ed. Caleb looked at Evelyn. "She'll think about it for 3 days and then pick something completely unexpected," Evelyn said. "I figured," he said. The station at Millhaven was still there, of course. The frontier did not remove its pieces, simply because a chapter had ended. The platform still had its boards. The lamppost still stood, and on cold evenings Gerald Potts still closed the doors at 9 o'clock and went home to his supper without much thought for what the darkness outside might contain. Evelyn passed through Millhaven often enough, for supplies, for correspondence, for the school days when she went herself instead of sending Lily with Cord. Passed the station without ceremony. It was a building, functional and unremarkable, and the night she had spent on its platform had the quality all the hardest times had eventually taken on real and carried, and no longer the defining thing. What she had learned over the months between that platform and this life was something she would not have put in simple words, even if someone had asked her for them, because simple words had a way of making things small that were not small. But if she'd had to come close to it, she would have said this, that desperation and dignity were not opposites, and that the second did not require the first to be absent. She had been desperate on that platform, genuinely, completely, without resources, and she had also refused to be less than herself inside it, and that refusal had not saved her. But it had kept her recognizable to herself, long enough for other things to be possible. She had not been rescued. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself if to no one else. Caleb had offered work to someone who needed it, and she had taken the work and done it fully, and what had grown from that was something built by both of them, with both their hands. The building had not been smooth. It had not been certain. There had been the storm and the water and the 4 o'clock dark and the months of fear about a legal situation that could have gone differently, and the loneliness of being a stranger in a place where everyone else knew each other and she knew no one, and the hard, specific loneliness of making every decision alone when she was used to making decisions with someone. None of that had been taken from her. It had just been added to in the accumulating way that life added to things when you stayed present inside it, instead of waiting for it to resolve into something manageable. Lily called him Caleb for 3 days. As predicted, and then on the 4th morning came to breakfast and called him Dad in the same even tone she used for all factual statements, as if it were a thing that had simply always been true, and she was only now getting around to saying it out loud. Caleb looked at the table for a moment. Then he passed her the biscuits and told her to eat while they were hot, and she did, and the morning went on around them, with the ordinary momentum of a day that had work in it, and people to do it, and enough warmth to make the work worth doing. Outside, the prairie ran to every horizon in the long light of a June morning, and the cattle were in the north pasture, where the creek ran clear through the land that was his and hers, and nobody was going to take. And somewhere in the yard, Ed Pruitt was already explaining something to a 6-year-old who was listening with her whole self. And the world was imperfect and unfinished, and going on regardless, the way it always had and always would. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.